little cohort of advisors around him decided they wanted to stop that. And, just as you saw in that press conference, it's clear that what happened behind the scenes is that the professional military and their rules were overridden by Rumsfeld and his team, who basically required them to disobey the law because the requirements of the law are completely clear. Rumsfeld required them to ignore the law. And what this means is that responsibility for this misconduct and these violations of the law doesn't rest with the American soldiers out in the field. It rests directly with Donald Rumsfeld. He's the one who made that decision. He's the one who pushed it through. He, therefore, bears the legal responsibility for the violations.
Well, and here's the thing. Well, there's a couple of things here. I guess just put this one aside because I'll forget by the time I get to it. There's American laws that enforce these international treaties that we're part of, that are passed by the Congress and signed by the President, and so I want to know about those. But it's worth mentioning here that this didn't work. If the El Salvador option was to decapitate the leadership of the insurgency by using the Badr Corps, then it was based on ignorance of the fact that the Badr Corps and the Supreme Islamic Council, and for that matter, Muqtada al-Sadr and his Mahdi army, had their own priorities, such as, for example, taking Baghdad for themselves. And what happened was they precipitated a civil war that killed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. Mm-hmm. And then, they only won by giving up because they helped install this brutal, torture drill-wielding political power that doesn't need us anymore. And so all of this was for nothing. It didn't accomplish any of his goals. For anyone who says, yeah, well, screw them, we got to be tough and do the things we got to do and whatever. Well, all it did was make everything worse for everybody and accomplish nothing. But
Scott,
then
you're contradicting the major narrative in Washington today, which is the surge worked, God bless General Petraeus.
Yeah, the surge worked. Ask Muqtada al-Sadr, who rules Baghdad. He'll tell you it's him. In fact, this guy, I'm sorry, the name of the author is escaping me, but the book is The Good Soldiers. Washington Post guy wrote it, and I interviewed him on this show. And in that book, it's the story of guys who were fighting against the Sadrists in 2006 and 7. They had no idea that they were on the side of the Sadrists in the Civil War whatsoever, as they're patrolling the Sadrist neighborhoods and killing people. They don't even know, even their commander, Kazlarich, who himself, I believe, is guilty of war crimes. Two different people under him on this show, soldiers on this show, said that he gave them orders to fire 360 degrees at anything that moves, anything that could possibly be a target in the event of any IED going off. And but even that war criminal, apparent accused war criminal, Scott, didn't even know he was fighting on the side of the people he was fighting against in the middle of this stupid war. And I guess I'll ask you about more legalities when we get back from this break. Everybody, it's the Other Scott Horton. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Antiwar Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Scott Horton. He's a heroic anti-torture human rights lawyer, contributing editor at Harper's Magazine, the oldest continuously published, most prestigious magazine in the country's history, all that. Now, what is this New York Times torture euphemism generator I'm looking at, Scott?
Oh, boing, boing, boing. That's where it is. You have to go check it out. But, a couple of people looking at the New York Times coverage of WikiLeaks were absolutely amazed at how they're discussing in thousands of words instances of torture, and they never use once the word torture. And the recommendation here is to make life easier for the writers at the New York Times. Let's create a machine that'll give them 1,001 euphemisms for torture so they can live up to their editor's rules of not using that word. Because the New York Times rule is that nothing the United States does or is involved with constitutes torture. So if there's U.S. involvement, they have to use a different word than torture.
It's harsh interrogation techniques to, put a drill through somebody's head or burn them to death or that kind of thing.
But you just have to go to boingboing.net /2010/10/22 torture, and you'll see there the proposal for the device.
Awesome. That sounds like a lot of great fun. And, this brings up something that Glenn Greenwald wrote about yesterday and something that Justin Raimondo also mentioned in his column, which I think is really notable, and that is that the New York Times and the Washington Post are acting just as the state's henchmen in the character assassination of Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks organization. And as Greenwald writes it, it was Nixon's thugs who handled this when it came to trying to smear and destroy Dan Ellsberg. It's part of what got him removed from office, was breaking into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try to get dirt on him. And now we got the Post and the Times are leading the charge, both of them with really long and I don't know what to call them, but pathetic kind of hit pieces on Assange to go to and as Greenwald points out, I think at the New York Times, they're running it as or more prominently than any of the rest of the stories about the 400,000 documents.
That is the lead, and in fact, when you look at their review of the documents, they give very, very prominent play to documents that cast the government in a positive light. So they're saying basically how the U.S. government was struggling with Iranian terrorism going on in Iraq.
Oh yeah, Michael Gordon had a whole piece justifying himself.
Exactly, and which I talk with people at the Pentagon. They say, well, you have to understand that in the Rumsfeld Pentagon, people were under immense pressure to write reports and ginny up studies and claims to justify the Rumsfeld Pentagon's claims about Iran. And whenever there's top-down pressure to do this, of course, people write pieces of paper that support what the leadership wants. So it's really nothing more than that.
Well, and Gates' Pentagon, too, because what we're talking about is right when Gates came into power in the first 6 months of 2007, the time when they basically just said, forget the nuclear weapons program that doesn't exist for a while. Let's just accuse them of being responsible for everything that's wrong in Iraq, even though, as we already talked about, America was fighting on Iran's side from late 2003, well, really from March 2003 on. We were fighting to install the Iranian Revolution, and they blamed the Iranians for being behind any roadside bomb that had a copper core to it, even though it was proven 10,000 times that those things were being manufactured all across Iraq. Gareth Porter showed that they got the technology from Hezbollah in Lebanon, not from the Iranians in the first place, but they were being made domestically, and they never, Michael Gordon, nor Petraeus, nor Gates, ever provided any real evidence at all for the accusations that the reason the solderists were resisting was because the Iranians were making them do it and giving them the bombs to do it with. They accused them of that 1,000,000 times, and the best I can tell, they never proved a word of it.
Well, that's right. And in fact, the public editor in the New York Times asked me to write a piece after I had a discussion with him about this very subject, because I was living and working in Baghdad in the spring of 2006. I was there working on an assignment for CBS News. And while I was there, I observed public affairs officers for the Baghdad command come around and repeatedly attempt to peddle exactly the story that Michael Gordon wrote, with the same sites and the same so-called evidence and so forth. I saw this happen at least 2 separate times. And he then presents this story as like his original reporting with this information. But, I mean, really, it was a prepackaged, public affairs message from the Pentagon. And I know a lot of other really more serious professional journalists looked at it and said, this is borderline crude propaganda. But one other point I want to make is that when we look through all these documents, it really is pretty clear that you get to the end of 2006 and there's a shift from Rumsfeld to Gates. And when Gates comes in, he really does make an effort to pull back from some of the most serious abuses. So one thing that becomes quite clear from these documents is that when the shift from Rumsfeld to Gates comes, there's a new attitude introduced towards the treatment of the prisoners held by the United States. And Gates really does send people in and start cleaning that situation up. So, we have this period that runs after the disclosures of Abu Ghraib through roughly the end of 2006, where, pretty bad abuses are still going on in detention facilities all over Iraq. I'm talking about abuses, by the United States involving the detention facilities it's operating, not involving the Iraqi forces. And it's the beginning of 2007 that we see finally a pretty significant shift away from the most abusive practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Abu Ghraib is absolutely horrible, and everybody who hasn't read the Taguba report really needs to. But, there's also a great documentary that Frontline did called The Torture Question, where at least one of the guys in there, Tony Lugaranis, who I think later wrote a book about it, said, oh, forget Abu Ghraib. We torture these people in their own homes. We torture them on the side of the road. We torture them in their front yard. We torture them in their backyard. We torture them in front of their daughter. We tortured them from, as Tom Friedman would say, from Baghdad to Basra, and for that matter, up through Fallujah and Tikrit as well. Mosul.
Yeah, that's right. That's Joshua Phillips' book. None of us were like this before, in which he documents that out in the road. Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. But I do want to give a bit of a bouquet, a small one, to Gates, because it does seem to me pretty clear from these documents that he pulled back from the worst abuses, and he did this almost immediately when he came into office. So that's good.
That's true. Although it seemed to me, and I think Robert Perry did a really good job writing about this at Consortium News, that the reason they got rid of Rumsfeld was because he's enough of his own self-interested jerk that he was willing to just cut his losses and say, let's stop this thing. That's what he was finally proposing was, the phrase, let's take the training wheels off and let them see if they can stand on their own. They're like a dependent on welfare, and we have to let them, cut our losses and go now or whatever. And that was why they brought in Gates, was because he would give the realist stamp on the Fred Kagan surge, the AEI Petraeus surge to escalate the war and to stay another couple of years longer than James Baker and them were recommending in the commission report.
I think that's definitely correct. That that Rumsfeld had really rigorously opposed the surge. Was in favor of. He wanted to be in and out very quickly, and he was arguing steadily for drawing down and leaving quickly. Notwithstanding what you heard in the press and the papers about that time, the inside word was that Rumsfeld wanted out, and Gates was committed to I think the surge approach, and had that commitment before. But we also have to remember, after the election in November of 2006. Rumsfeld was a real political albatross for the Bush administration. His poll numbers had plummeted, and people viewed Rumsfeld as the man responsible for a clearly failed war. So there wasn't too much question about what was going to happen to him after the votes were counted.
Yeah. Geez, if they'd only listened to Sandra Day O'Connor and James Baker III, of all people, we'd have been out of there in 2008. Or at least down to these troop levels in 2008. All right, one more segment with the Other Scott Horton. We got some legalities and some WikiLeaks to talk about here. It's Anti-War Radio. Hang tight. Yeah, the gates of hell, all right. That's this song by the Bruisers. So, hey, I finally figured out which page I'm supposed to be looking at for the New York Times torture euphemism generator, recommended to me by the Other Scott Horton, who's on the line here. Here we have reports of possible distressing truth-finding metrics. And you just click Get a New Headline. It refreshes for you. Reports of possible conversational physical expediations. Amplified intelligence ultimata. Permanent soul removal. Okay, I'm having fun. Boingboing.net for the New York Times torture euphemism generator. And we're talking about the hell that was the Iraq War, that still is, really, in a way, except finally our combat forces are removed to their bases instead of out kicking indoors all day, every day. Although there's an article on Antiwar.com today where a soldier talks about how bored he is because he wants to be the guy kicking indoors, but now it's the Iraqi army kicking indoors. So that's what armies are for. That's what liberty is. Exporting freedom to Iraq means they're under permanent martial law, getting their doors kicked in by soldiers. But so anyway, I want to nail down some specifics with you, Scott Horton, since you are an international human rights and international law expert, lawyer, attorney, and formerly with one of the most powerful law firms in New York City. I want to understand, and the chair of the committee of the Bar Association in New York, I want to understand about the laws that Donald Rumsfeld, George Bush, Dick Cheney, their neocons, etc., committed here. It seems like there's a prima facie case, I think they call it, right? But which laws are they in violation of? And please don't cite the Geneva Convention, because that's pinko, commie, baby blue, UN things. Tell me about American laws. That's what counts.